Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSat Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in global environmental conflicts we will be talking about conflicts over natural resources in early India. To discuss this topic we have with us our subject expert Dr. Neeraj Sahai. Dr. Neeraj Sahai is Associate Professor in Department of History in Sri Venkateswara College, University of Delhi. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture.
Welcome, sir. Today our topic is agrarian societies in early India, and I would first begin with early medieval period and then like to go back to the ancient times. The reason for this may sound intriguing, but the fact is that we try to look at picture for which we have a more clear understanding, more nuanced understanding to the period for which we have very scarce sources. We have the picture may not be so complete as far as the ancient times are concerned. So I'll begin with agrarian societies in early medieval period, and I basically talk about conflicts, contestations and negotiations. As far as conflicts and contestations are concerned, at the very outset I want to put it before all of you that conflict and contestations are result of certain policies as well as scarcity of resources, and then there are competing claims. How different communities, different set of people, state and people, how they enter into some kind of negotiations is also an important part of this discussion. Now let us look at the objective. As you all know, in any expanding agricultural society, land happens to be the most important resource. Not that land is the only resource, but we have other important resources. For example, we have water is very, very important for cultivation. Then we have animal power is also very, very important. And then we have forests, forest produce. All these are part of expanding agrarian society. Because agrarian society is not a simple society which is only defined in terms of cultivation. And there are various natural resources in agrarian society, and as I said, we start with land. Land happens to be the most important resource, and then we have animal power. Cattle may be very, very important, and we have other kind of animals which are used for the purpose of agriculture or which are used for some kind of trading or which actually exist in kind of mutually supporting economy. And we also have forests as very important area from where the agrarian societies also draw their resources. Now when we look at the expanding agrarian economy, one has to go back into time to understand how all this has been viewed. So let us look at the antecedents. The earlier picture about resources was that in early India people lived in harmony with nature. Also this picture of harmony of society where people did exist in harmony, kind of peaceful coexistence, if we could use that term. However, this cherished notion is demolished by the fact that from 1960s through 1980s there started research on peasants and how the peasants were protesting against the problem that they faced, against any kind of monopoly or kind of sharing or kind of competing claims that 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 they had to encounter. So one has to look at the entire picture, and one has to understand that it's no longer seen as a harmonious society, but through 1960s to 80s we find that the peasant protest has become very, very important. Now the issue is why the peasants would protest over resources, why there was some kind of resentment, why there was some kind of resistance, why there was some kind of confrontation. Generally it is said that tax happens to be very, very important, and any state would support itself with the help of finance and army. Nowadays we are also talking about the ideological power of the state, but finances are very, very important, and generally it was understood that the burden of taxation fell on peasants. So peasants were not only giving maximum rents or taxes, they were also subjected to coercion. This could be economic as well as extra economic in nature. Also, when we talk about resources and we talk about rights in a certain given area, one has to understand that there could be different set of rights. People who existed there and who practiced their old customary rights. R.A. Sharma talks about rights, local rights, customs and contract, which could be disturbed by the coming of an outsider who was supposed to have a superior set of rights over the same resources. So this was definitely going to bring about some kind of confrontation. Now, how does one define conflict? There are various ways in which one can define conflict, but generally, as it has been understood in the academic circles, as far as peasants were concerned, and I am concentrating on the peasants here, there could be some kind of emotional resentment, which is a simple dissent. But when it is matched by a social action, which is supposed to bring about some kind of change, so the social action may become protest. Now, among these kind of definitions, it's important to understand that conflict could only be one kind of manifestation in the regional context. There could be other defining features also, and the protest or the resentment could be against the king, could be against the officials. For example, we have evidence of Harsha having encountered his own people complaining about the conduct of his Bhogpati as well as his officials who were supposed to be fleecing them, supposed to be exploiting them. So that resentment was very much there in early times as well as in early medieval period. Also, there could be some kind of confrontation between the lower peasantry and the landlord. As we know, peasantry has never been homogeneous, and one has to understand that there could be agricultural laborers, there could be sharecroppers, there could be landlords. So it could be a multi-tiered kind of a multi-tiered structure. Also, there could be new beneficiary, as we were talking about new superior set of rights, and how the superior set of rights were supposed to be contradicting or supposed to be challenging the old customary rights which were done through justifications from Dharma Shastras or the legal texts. In the Jataka stories, in the Jataka stories, we come across picture of resentment or kind of a protest against the king, and normally this was led by a Brahmin. So this kind of images are not found in very many examples, and we find that it was only in the early medieval centuries that the picture of contestations and conflict over resources becomes clearer. Also, as far as the early medieval centuries were concerned, it was outside the Gangetic Valley that one could find these conflicts over natural resources. The fact is that it was only outside the Gangetic Valley that we find development of expansion of agriculture, and not within the Gangetic Valley. And so one can say that this conflict and these contestations were to be have to be understood properly. Now, what was the instrument of this agrarian expansion that we are talking about? We are told that Brahmins were the beneficiary of land grants. They were given land, and with the help of land grants, they carried agricultural expansion in areas which were hitherto not open to cultivation. So we find that newer areas are brought under cultivation, and Brahmins were supposed to be the harbingers of this kind of change. Now, not everybody would today agree with this fact that agrarian expansion could only be the result of Brahmadeya grants. However, were these Brahmadeya grants a very simple way of fostering agricultural expansion? Was there no resistance? Was it a very peaceful method where with the help of Brahmanical ideology one could go about expanding agriculture? The fact is that there could have been use of force and negotiation side by side, or one could say that it could be a blend of coercion as well as persuasion. One of the examples that we have before us is Dalavpuram plate of early Pandyas. Now, this is a very interesting inscription which tells us about the methods of resistance and contestations. This inscription actually tells us about how there was resistance among the local Shudras pertaining to Ek Bhoga Brahmadeya. These peasants, these local Shudras also had the support of their neighboring clan chieftains, clan leaders, and as a result, the situation was in turmoil, and it did necessitate the royal mediation. The royal intervention was required, and with the royal intervention, these local Shudras, with their local support also, got this Ek Bhoga Brahmadeya changed into a corporate Brahmadeya. So it tells us how there were not only conflicts or contestations. What was the result of these contestations? Did these contestations bring about some kind of negotiation? Were these used to bring about a situation of conciliation? So we have another example, and this example comes from Bengal. Bengal, as you know, was under the rule of Palas in early medieval period, and we have a very important work called Ramcharita, written by Sandhyakar Nandi, and this tells us about the revolt of the Kaivartas, and in fact it does tell us about how Divyoka and his descendant Bhima, dated to late 11th century, were successful in crushing the Kaivarta revolt. Now, this Kaivarta revolt did take place because of various factors. So, what were these factors? We find that there could be variety of issues. One is alienation of land. When the land was never in plenty, land could always be scarce as far as the good quality agricultural land was concerned. So alienation of land was very important, and it must have made the situation worse for Kaivartas. Also, Kaivartas were expected to pay heavy taxes, but besides maximization of rent or just taking away of land or alienating land in favor of the newer donis or in the favor of the state, were not in themselves so important factors. There was another important factor, was how the state was trying to expand its control over Varendra region. This region did comprise of Malda, Rajshahi, Dinajpur, etc. And as a result, we find that there was resistance from the local people, Kaivartas, because on one hand we find that the state was expanding or asserting its right. On the other hand, there was erosion of the local rights. So the state might was confronted with the local resistance, and as a result we find that the Kaivartas were able to negotiate, and they also got the right of change of their occupation, and also it tells us how the contestations on conflicts can give way to some kind of negotiations. State was not always in confrontation with the marginalized or the poor or the people on the frontiers, but also people who were supposed to be co-sharer of authority or people who could pose some kind of challenge as far as the local resources were concerned. And we find that the state sometimes also was in confrontation with the landed aristocracy. We find agitation taking place in Tanjore, and this was known as Chobham. We also find that the state was hostile to the Brahmins and the Velila landlords, and Rajaraja III and Kulotonga III, these rulers were against Brahmanas and Velila landlords. Also, there could be other manifestations of protest, and these were seen in terms of temple records being burnt, then settlement and resettlement, delineation of land grants, redelineation, all these things were important. We find that the Devadasis were self-immolating, and in inscriptions certain terms like Rajdroha and Rajdrohin could be found. Now these tell us how the state and the local people had confrontation, and these confrontation could take various forms. Hero stones are supposed to be very important, and hero stones normally are found in areas which are fragile, which have fragile ecology, and they are not conducive for cultivation to a great extent. Also, it's not that these areas did not witness any agricultural expansion. Agriculture was taking place. I can tell you from my own experience of having studied the region of Andhra that the Rayalaseema area, the area of Rayalaseema, does yield inscriptions from 7th, 8th century, and these inscriptions tell us about land grants, though the size of the land may be smaller as compared to other areas. Also, in Rayalaseema and the adjoining Karnataka, we find that this is a contiguous zone where we find large number of hero stones, and the term hero actually comes from people who sacrifice their lives for the cause of either saving some kind of resources. These could be either cattle, some animals, or even their land, or some kind of confrontation. So situation of exigency could always emerge in fragile ecology, and R.N. Nandi does tell us about how Gauda peasants offered the resistance against Brahmana freeholding. They were not in the favor of Brahmana freehold land being given in their area. So there was confrontation. Many a times in these confrontations, the landlords or the dominant sections of the landed aristocracy sided with the state. So this tells us how the conflicts could emerge in expanding agrarian areas. Also, there is a very interesting oral tradition pertaining to Katam Raju Katha. It's called and pastoralism. This tells us about a certain hero, supposed to be a certain hero, who confronted Manuma Siddhi of Nellore, and there are various renditions of this story. We are told that there did take place a battle between Katam Raju and the Manuma Siddhi of Nellore over the use of rights of grazing the land. We are told that Manuma Siddhi had given the area for grazing, which was watered where the grass was watered, or where there was no dearth of grazing land. However, this was cleverly used by Katam Raju to graze the land where paddy stood in the fields. As a result, there took place a battle between Manuma Siddhi and Katam Raju. In another rendition, which is epigraphic, we find that this battle happened over non-payment of pullari or the grazing fee. Now, all this tells us how grazing was very much part of expanding agrarian frontiers, and we also see that agriculture is not only about cultivation, but there are other factors to it. We also find that there were conflicts in Tiruchirappalli in 13th-14th century between lower peasants and the landlords. Also, in the Vijayanagar, the soldiers turned to agriculture and land under Vijayanagar period. There are two very interesting views on peasant resistance. R.S. Sharma, who talks about conflict essentially based, and R.S. Sharma followed by B.N.S. Yadav, essentially talks about confrontation which happened because of maximization of rent, exploitation of peasantry, subjection, which is included in what he calls as critical characteristic features of Indian feudalism. And we have a very different picture given by R.N. Nandi, which is about growth of rural economy in early medieval centuries, where agricultural growth, technology, crop production, development of market and towns provided enough for different vested interests to have competing claims, and this probably led to peasant conflicts. However, these conflicts are not seen, and there are several factors. Bhakti movement did absorb this, or Gita with its emphasis on Varna and gender hierarchy. Temples were important sites of accommodation and assimilation, and caste system, of course, and theory of karma. So there could be various methods of cultural indoctrination to absorb and preempt any kind of resistance. However, these had their own limitations. The reform movements, after a point in time, also returned back to orthodoxy. Thank you. Hello again. So far, we have tried to understand the agrarian society in early medieval India and how there could be conflicts, contestations, and negotiations over natural resources. Now we'll be looking at the situation in early India. As I've already told you before, that situation in early India is far from being so clear as is early medieval, and we try to make meaning over the kind of conflict over natural resources that we can find. Now, what are the natural resources in the agrarian societies? This is something that we've discussed before in the last lecture. The natural resources in the agrarian society would largely comprise of land, water, animal. One is also tempted to actually include human resources, as well as the forest, because there always is a connection between what is supposed to be the settled land and what is supposed to be the barbaric or the forest, and there is no dichotomy. It's an imagined dichotomy. The fact is that they were always mutually dependent. Now, conflict over natural resources can be seen in the sources. Our own sources in history, for example, literature, we have Dharma Shastras or the legal texts which alienate resources in favor of the dominant sections of the society. Then we have inscriptions where we have a different picture. We have a far more real picture where the land is donated, and this was not only donated to Brahmanas, where the land is donated, where the water resources could be alienated, where the productivity of the land is also indicated. So all this could be transferred in the name of an individual or a group of people. When we talk about agriculture, does agriculture only mean cultivation, or it is something more than that? David Ludden, in his study of agriculture of South Asia, says that one should have a broad definition where not only cultivation but also pastoralism, cattle rearing, fishing, even forest harvesting should be part of this definition of agriculture, because there are diverse production systems, and these production systems do not operate in isolation. Now, of the various resources that we have, water resources are very, very important. Water resources are important for expansion of agriculture. Irrigation is a very important factor, especially in a country where agriculture depends on monsoon. So methods of irrigation, different methods of irrigation are supposed to be very, very important, and there could be various mechanisms of control also as far as water resources are concerned. When we say various mechanisms of control, who is controlling water resources? Is it the community which is controlling? Is there a communal control? That society by and large, local communities do have a control? Or is it the state which is having overall monopoly over all water resources? Or is it the individual who is having control over water resources? Now, when you talk about early India by convention does also include, besides ancient, early medieval centuries. As far as water resources are concerned, there is this debate about the control of water resources. We all know about Asiatic mode of production and how it tries to view society, economy and polity. A very important feature of despotism is based on water resources. That it was because of monopoly over water resources in ecologically fragile area that the state could generate enough surplus and could afford to be despotic in nature. Mauryan period is supposed to be an example of having produced Oriental despotism. So the state control over economy, according to Wittfogel, could be the result of hydraulic despotism or could be the result of control over water resources. However, the state control over water resources is far from being clear in the context of the Mauryan period. But and except few references that we find in Arthashastra or Rudradaman's inscription of Junagadh, there is not much to support that the state had absolute control over water resources. Also, we cannot talk in terms of production of surplus to the extent that state could be despotic in nature. As far as the situation in early medieval period is concerned, we find that agrarian expansion was largely facilitated with the help of artificial irrigation, and a very important case in point is how in different areas different kind of water resources were important, and for the purpose of agriculture, especially what we find in the land grant inscriptions is endowment of tanks or water bodies. Some of the references could mere be incidental in nature. However, tanks were constructed and used for agricultural expansion. This comes out very clearly in the case of Telangana, which opened to agrarian expansion in a large way from in the aftermath of 10th century AD. And we find that this situation could also be seen elsewhere. So tank construction was very, very important as far as agrarian expansion is concerned, and this is borne out very clearly in the land grant inscriptions. Also, it's not only about reference to land grant, but many times we find that there are very clear links between the tanks, the productivity in the region, the kind of crop that they were produced, that or the fields or the plots which could be irrigated. Many times we also have a reference to management of water resources, or we also know about irrigation cess. So irrigation was definitely important. State had an interest in promoting agrarian expansion so that it could get rent from a certain areas could be brought under cultivation. But water resources could not have been under the control of the state. They were transferred to the individuals, even if it was used for a certain period or certain tenure. Then there could be water bodies or tanks which were located at the junction of villages, or they appeared as some kind of nodal points in the village, or helped in creating what is called as supra-village organization, because they necessitated some kind of coming together of different villages, different localities, and they had to manage the water resources in a very judicious way. If not judicious, if not, let us not use the word harmonious, but it brought together people, different communities, and it could be used collectively. Now, resource sharing is very, very important as far as water resources are concerned. The inscriptions tell us about alienation of water resources, allocation to certain fields. We also have imprecatory verses where any kind of trespassing or any kind of damage to water resources was warned about, and there could also be disputes as far as water resources and their usage was concerned, and in this case there were possibilities of arbitration. Sometimes we find validation from the Dharma Shastras or the legal texts which are mentioned in the land grant inscriptions. Now, land ownership is again very, very important. Land is supposed to be the primary natural resource which is used in agricultural expansion. So, who was the owner of this very important resource? Was the state owner of the resource, or were the communities or the local people were owner of this land? The fact is that theoretically speaking, state was the owner of the land, and this is borne out in texts. However, in practice, the land could be used by different people, and people who created, invested, or kind of sponsored in development of any land, they had the right of cultivation, especially if they brought a certain land hitherto not cultivated into cultivation initially, then they could be given right for a certain period. So the fact is that theoretically speaking, state could be the owner, whereas in practice we find that it could be the peasants or the cultivators who exercised a certain right. As far as Asiatic mode of production is concerned, it does try to look at village communities in essentially uncritical way, and it is suggested that the land could be owned, of not owned, at least tenure could be owned by the community, so there could be a communal land tenure. However, state played a very, very important role, made interventions, did organize agriculture, and as a result was interested in maximizing profit or rent from the land. So the surplus could go to the state. In such a situation where there was communal land tenure and where there was where the surplus could be appropriated by the state, there was no class opposition. This is the picture which is given in the Asiatic mode of production. However, we find that agrarian expansion in early India had a different trajectory. Land grants came to be given from the time of Satavahanas in the post-Mauryan centuries. if we compare the Mauryan period to that of post-Mauryan centuries, we find that the Mauryan economy was largely seen as a state control economy, and this was based on the study of Arthashastra, Megasthenes Indica, as well as the provenance of Ashokan inscriptions. However, if we compare this period to that of the post-Mauryan centuries, we find that the post-Mauryan centuries had possibilities of individual land holdings. R.S. Sharma long back, in his characterization of economy of the Mauryan and the post-Mauryan centuries, did talk about state control of economy followed by a period of state as well as private land holdings. This is not to suggest that we should look at both these periods in absolute terms, that Mauryan period did not have possibilities of other than state control of economy, or there could not be individual or private enterprises. However, the fact is that this is how the conventional picture has been given as far as the land holdings are concerned. In the later period, especially in the early medieval centuries, we find that there could be sale and purchase of land. So land was not totally under state control as is generally believed. There could be private enterprises, and there could also be sale and purchase of land. There could be auction also of land in the early medieval centuries. Forests are another area which are important for development of economy, and the state has always used the resources from the forest. We are told that in Arthashastra there are references to conservation of forest, but we have another picture where forest tribes are warned also. Atviks were warned, especially in the Rock Edict 13, where Ashoka categorically warns Atviks not to mess up with the state, else force could be used against them. Now, how does one understand such statements? We know that in the Mauryan period, there was much more importance given to Hastivana than Dravyavana. Dravyavana was where one could find the material sources or resources required by the state, and Hastivana was where one could find elements. Now, it was possible to increase the numbers as far as Dravyavana were concerned, but Hastivana was a scarce natural resource, so it was to be handled carefully. Aloka Parashar talks about intrusion of the state in the forest during the Mauryan period, and we know that this intrusion was based on requirements of the state. This intrusion did disturb the economic and the social texture, as a result of which we find that there could be some kind of resistance, some kind of tension. Talking about the conflict, Aloka Parashar says that the tension between the state and the peasants can be actually traced back from the Mauryan period. Talking about pastoralism, which is supposed to be a very important occupation, kind of a production system where horses, cows and pastures can be emphasized upon, and I am referring to the Vedic period, specifically talking about the early Vedic period or the Rig Vedic period. Romila seeks to ask the question, at what time one can place the beginning of peasant economy in early India? Was it the Rig Vedic period? Does Vish mean beginnings of peasant economy? Rig Vedic and later Vedic society have been characterized differently. In the Rig Vedic society, cow with emphasis on different declensions, the word go, in their different declensions like Gomad, Gopati, Godhuli, etc., tells us that how cows could be important, or the word go could be important for the Rig Vedic economy. Can it be seen to be an important phase for pastoral economy? In fact, the nature of control in state in early India is quite varied, and Romila Thapar talks about environmental circumscription, meaning that if the sedentary agriculturists could be surrounded by a more powerful class of pastoralists, then they would not migrate, but they did adapt. And so this adaptation could be kind of development of symbiotic relationship. This could be seen during the decline of Harappan period and the advent of the Aryans. Now, with the migration in Doab also, we find that there could be conflicts, and these conflicts were basically about territorial control and right of succession over these territories, and we have a lot of battles like the Sarajana battle or Bharata having fought many battles, and this is again the story about resettlement of land, how the people who were living on land, whether they were pushed out to the frontiers or were they absorbed in the new society. Now, to conclude, one would say that state formation and stratification are supposed to be prerequisite, and it is the stratified groups which actually involve in internal conflicts, and this stratification actually plays a very, very important role in negotiation which brings about state formation. Thank you.
On that note, I would like to thank sir for this very enriching discussion, and thank you dear friends for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.